The police officer kept chasing the puppy away, thinking it was lost. When he tried to calm down and looked at the dog and found a note attached to its neck that read, "Help, my nephew has been sick for days. No food." He felt like he couldn't breathe. Officer Dillon had just finished a grueling night shift that pushed him to the brink of exhaustion. Weary-eyed and longing for his soft bed, he ambled through a dimly lit alley, the neon glow of a flickering street lamp illuminating puddles of stagnant water. As he trudged forward, his attention was suddenly drawn to a small, sloppy sheepdog trudging behind him. At first, he paid it no heed. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in these parts of the city, and there were shelters to handle them. However, this one seemed different. It followed him relentlessly, step after step, as though on a mission. When Dillon paused to turn around, the puppy's dark eyes shone with a silent plea. Its ribs were visible through its matted fur, and it trembled from the night chill. Dillon tried to wave it off. "Go on, get," he muttered, hoping the puppy would scurry away, but it stayed. Finally, curiosity overcame him. Kneeling, he realized the pup wore a worn collar. Tucked inside was a piece of paper, crumpled and stained. With growing concern, he unfolded it. Scrawled in uneven letters was a message that sent a jolt through his system. "Help, my nephew is sick. No food, no water. Apartment 3, A." Those words changed everything. His fatigue evaporated as adrenaline and a sense of duty kicked in. Clutching the note, he stared at the puppy. Its ears perked, and it whined softly as if urging him to hurry. Fatigue had weighed heavily on Dillon, and normally, he might have reported the situation for another unit to handle. But there was something in the dog's eyes, a stark desperation that made it impossible for him to walk away. He wondered who had written the note. Why leave a dog with such a message instead of calling for help? The pup, though small, possessed a determined spirit. Every time Dillon tried to move in the opposite direction, the dog barked in protest. Resolved, Dillon bent down and gave it a reassuring pat. "Okay, buddy, show me the way." The dog's tail wagged as if it understood what he said. Dillon followed behind the puppy. His mind whirled with questions. How sick was the child? How old could they be? Was there anyone else in apartment 3A? The thought of a helpless child lying alone without food or water was enough to spur him forward. The dog guided Dillon through twisting back streets and run-down blocks. Buildings with shattered windows and graffiti-stained walls loomed above him. Each step echoed in the silent streets, punctuated only by the soft patter of the pup's paws. Dillon pressed forward, adrenaline overpowering any lingering exhaustion. When they finally reached a decrepit apartment complex, the pup bounded up a set of cracked concrete steps. The building looked as if it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, the broken windows were patched with cardboard, and a flickering overhead light barely provided enough light. A pungent odor drifted through the air, a cocktail of rot and must. Standing before the door marked 3A, Dillon knocked firmly. Silence. He knocked again, louder but still no answer. The puppy began scratching at the door, whimpering. Fearing for the worst, Dillon decided there was no time to waste. He steeled himself and took a step back, delivering a forceful kick near the door's lock. The flimsy doorframe splintered under Dillon's kick, swinging inward to reveal a dark, cramped space. The first assault on his senses was the stench, a pungent mix of unwashed clothes, stale air, and underlying decay. Dillon's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim interior. The single overhead bulb flickered weakly. Garbage bags were strewn across the floor, and empty cans littered a makeshift kitchen area. It was an assault on every sense, and Dillon had to swallow hard to keep the revulsion from overwhelming him. The puppy darted inside, weaving around a toppled chair. Dillon followed carefully, scanning every corner. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, uncertain of what he might find. Then he spotted something, a shape on a low cot in the corner of what must have been a living room once. His flashlight revealed an elderly man, gaunt and ashen, lying almost motionless. Beside him, half covered by a thin blanket, was a boy, alarmingly small and still. Dylan's pulse sped up. He rushed over to check on them. The old man opened his eyes slightly at the disturbance, breath rasping in shallow gasps. The child, perhaps 5 years old, was flushed with fever. Beads of sweat lined his forehead. The puppy scrambled onto the cot, nuzzling the boy's tiny hand and whimpering. With tremendous effort, the old man tried to lift himself into a sitting position. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Save my nephew." Coughing interrupted his words, his frame trembling with the force. Dylan leaned in. "I found a note in the dog's collar. Are you the one who wrote it?" The old man nodded weakly. "He is my grandson by adoption," he whispered. "I found him years ago in an alley. A note said parents left, would come back, but they never did." Heart twisting in sympathy, Dylan gently touched the boy's burning forehead. The child stirred, letting out a weak whimper. "I will call an ambulance right away," Dylan said, pulling out his phone. The old man nodded, relief flooding his eyes at the mention of medical help. For the boy, not for himself. While Dylan dialed for an ambulance, the old man's frail voice tried to relay a heartbreaking story in bits and pieces. He explained that the parents had abandoned the boy at birth in a grimy alley nearby. The man, who at the time was living off a meager pension, discovered the child by chance, swaddled in a thin blanket with a note pinned to it, bearing a simple plea. "Take care of my son." Stricken by empathy, he had taken the baby in. For several years, he managed to scrape together enough to feed and shelter him. But the old man's health deteriorated rapidly. With no money for hospital visits, he struggled to provide the basics. The boy's name was Paul, he explained, chosen from a storybook he found in a secondhand store. Now, with no food or water left, and his own strength dwindling, the old man had penned one last note and placed it in the puppy's collar, praying someone, anyone, would find it. Dylan listened, horrified at their dire situation, promising silently that he would not abandon them. Dylan tried to contain his emotions. His call to emergency services was urgent. "I have a child here, about 5 years old, with a high fever. The conditions are unlivable. We also have an elderly man, severely ill." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The old man locked eyes with Dylan. "Save the boy," he pleaded, voice trembling. "I'm out of time." Dylan wanted to object, to reassure him that help was coming for both of them. But one look at the old man's gaunt face told him that the man believed his final act was to ensure Paul survived. Clutching the child closer, Dylan vowed he would do exactly that. Within minutes, the glow of red and blue lights flickered through the broken window. The puppy stood protectively at Paul's side, its worried whines echoing in the cramped apartment, as if it sensed the gravity of the situation. Medics rushed in, oxygen masks and stretchers at the ready. However, when they tried to assist the old man, he shook his head, coughing violently. "Help him," he rasped, pointing a frail finger toward Paul. "I don't need it." A paramedic gently insisted, but the old man was adamant. He refused any medical examination, repeating the same request over and over. "The boy. Take the boy." Time blurred. Dylan cradled Paul in his arms, feeling the boy's feverish skin and racing heartbeat. The puppy too whimpered at Dylan's feet. The old man's trembling voice caught Dylan's attention once more. "Take the dog to a shelter, or keep it safe," he pleaded. Then he added, eyes brimming with the last of his energy, "Take Paul to a children's center, an orphanage, anywhere he can survive." Dylan had no chance to respond before the man's eyes closed. One of the medics pressed fingers to the old man's wrist, shaking his head. he was gone. What happens in this gripping and emotional story? If you want to find out what happens next and how the boy's life after that can change everything, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Despite the urgency of the situation, Dylan found himself momentarily frozen, his mind replaying the old man's final words on a loop. Take Paul to a children's center. He looked down at the child, limp in a paramedic's arms, and felt an unbidden surge of protectiveness. So many questions collided in his thoughts. Would a children's center be equipped to handle a child who had gone through such trauma? A second medic touched Dylan's shoulder, urging him to step aside so they could load Paul into the waiting ambulance. The child's breathing was shallow. Each inhalation seemed an immense effort. His small fingers clung to the puppy's matted fur, refusing to let go. The puppy, perched anxiously on the stretcher, licked at the boy's cheek as if determined to keep him awake, like it knew losing consciousness might be dangerous. Dylan swallowed hard. He had seen plenty of tragedies in his years on the force. Drug overdoses, domestic disputes gone wrong, abandoned infants. But this boy's situation struck deeper. No parents, no extended family stepping forward, just an ailing old man who used his last breath to plead for help. He glanced around the cramped alley where the ambulance idled, lights strobing against the graffiti-splattered brick walls. One paramedic was already zipping the old man's body into a black bag, shutting away the last tie Paul had in this life. A wave of anger spiked in Dylan's chest. Anger at a system that could let people fall through the cracks. Anger that an innocent child was left with nothing more than a dying man's note and a loyal dog. Paul's eyelids fluttered. A soft moan escaped his lips. The puppy whimpered in tandem, its tail thumping once against the stretcher, as if trying to will the boy to stay present. Dylan's gaze shifted from the paramedic's clipboard to the ambulance's open doors. Doors that could lead the child to a future in state care. Or, if Dylan intervened, perhaps a future with genuine hope. The medic holding Paul looked up. "We need to move," she said gently. "He's stable for now, but we shouldn't delay." Dylan exhaled slowly. He could almost hear the old man's rasping voice in his head. Take care of him. The vow formed in Dylan's mind before he could second-guess it. Standing on that littered pavement, with sirens echoing through the neighborhood, Dylan made a quiet promise. To the old man who'd passed, to the frightened child, and to himself. He will help the boy have a better life. Clenching his jaw, Dylan stepped closer, placing a hand on the edge of the stretcher. "I'll go with him," he said, his voice tight but resolute. "I'll make sure he's looked after." The medic nodded, relief flickering across her face. She helped Dylan climb in beside the boy. The puppy nestled protectively on his lap. As the ambulance doors slammed shut behind them, Dylan caught one last glimpse of the alley, of the old man's covered form and the shattered doorway in the distance. A chill passed through him, part sorrow, part determination. The ambulance ride felt both swift and endless. Paul was strapped to a stretcher, an IV drip providing much-needed fluids. His fever gradually inched downward, but he remained mostly unresponsive. Dylan sat nearby, stroking the puppy's head to calm it. The dog's presence seemed to ease Paul's tension, even in his delirium. Outside the exam room, Dylan was soon met by two social workers, their expressions a mix of concern and professional detachment. They explained that Paul would be placed into emergency foster care once he stabilized. Dylan felt an unexpected twist in his gut. Reminded of the old man's last wish, Dylan heard his own voice unexpectedly interject. "I'll take him in, at least for now." Though the social workers initially exchanged puzzled glances at Dylan's sudden offer, they also sensed the gravity of Paul's condition. Malnourished, weak, and emotionally fragile. After a whirlwind of signatures, background checks, and hurried conversations in the hospital corridors, Dylan emerged from a blur of paperwork as Paul's temporary guardian. By the time the boy was discharged, before going home, he also named the puppy Levi, tail thumping anxiously against Dylan's ankles. Stepping into his modest one-bedroom apartment felt like entering a different life altogether. The futon couch where Dylan usually crashed after late shifts was still covered with half-read case files and a crusted pizza box. An unsteady stack of takeout containers teetered on the kitchen counter, and the sink was a graveyard of unwashed coffee mugs. Standing in the doorway, Dylan's heart clenched with the realization that his bachelor-style living space was nowhere near child-ready. He made a silent promise to whip it into shape. When Paul shuffled in, Levi right at his heels, the boy leaned heavily on the puppy for both balance and comfort. The hospital band was still wrapped around his tiny wrist, and dark circles rimmed his eyes. Dylan hastily cleared space on the couch, nudging aside fast food wrappers, then guided Paul to sit. That first dinner was a hastily put-together bowl of chicken soup, the only thing Dylan could manage without burning the house down. He mentally kicked himself for not having fresh groceries, vowing to run to the store first thing in the morning. Still, Paul spooned the soup quietly, pausing between gulps to feed Levi small chunks of meat. Watching the child's cautious expression, Dylan realized it wasn't just physical hunger he was addressing, but a sense of deep-seated insecurity. Later that evening, Dylan rummaged through his wardrobe, mostly mismatched towels and one spare blanket from his college days. He spread the blanket and a pillow on the couch, setting out a small glass of water on the coffee table. Initially, Paul perched on the edge of the makeshift bed, expression of stress. But when Dylan flicked off the main light, leaving only the dim glow of a hallway lamp, Paul's panic became palpable. The boy clutched Levi to his chest, his terrified eyes fixed on the dark corridor leading to the bathroom. Sensing the boy's fear, Dylan tried everything to reassure him. He cracked the window to let in a gentle breeze, turned on a soft nightlight in the hallway, and even moved the floor lamp closer to the couch so it cast a wider, comforting glow. Each time Dylan started to step away, Paul's breath would quicken, his small fingers shaking around the puppy's collar. In the end, Dylan dragged an old armchair close to the couch and sat, determined not to leave Paul's side until the boy drifted off. Only when Paul's eyelids finally fluttered shut, his hands still entangled in Levi's fur, did Dylan dare to breathe a bit easier. He leaned back, fatigue pressing down on him. Tomorrow, he'd have to tackle the chaos of creating a stable home. Grocery shopping, tidying the apartment, maybe finding a second-hand bed for Paul. But for now, as the boy's uneasy sleep started to settle and the puppy let out a quiet snore, Dylan felt a measure of relief. He might not have all the answers, but at least Paul wouldn't face another uncertain night alone. In the weeks that followed, Dylan's life underwent a remarkable transformation. He found himself setting an alarm an hour earlier to prepare breakfast for Paul. He'd learned the boy had a fondness for scrambled eggs and toast, simple, nourishing foods. Paul begins to adapt to his new life, but the shadows in his eyes slowly lifted. He flinched less frequently at sharp noises like door slams or sirens on the street. Late at night, Dylan would find him curled up with Levi on the living room rug, the dog's gentle breathing serving as a soothing lullaby. Sometimes, Paul had nightmares. Dylan would wake to muffled whimpers and rush to the child's side. Levi, too, would be there, licking Paul's hand or pressing its body against him until he calmed. In those moments, Dylan felt the old man's final wish: to see Paul in a place of safety and love. A sense of responsibility blossomed in Dylan's chest, deeper than he'd ever felt before. The city's bright morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, seeming to promise fresh starts. Dylan inhaled the crisp Monday air, trying to steady his own nerves as much as Paul's. Walking hand in hand, they passed lively storefronts and bustling commuters, the sounds of traffic mixing with Paul's quiet footsteps. With each step toward the local elementary school, Dylan felt the boy's grip tighten. He offered a reassuring squeeze in return, sensing a flicker of anticipation beneath Paul's apprehension. At the school's entrance, Dylan was greeted by administrative staff and a flurry of paperwork. There were forms to fill out, health records to update, and a few polite questions about Paul's background that Dylan answered as vaguely as possible. He could see Paul's gaze wandering over colorful posters lining the hallway, alphabet charts, student artwork, and motivational slogans about learning and friendship. A few other children hustled by, backpacks bouncing, their laughter echoing off the polished floors. Paul shrank closer to Dylan, looking both curious and intimidated. Soon they reached a bright, inviting classroom, decorated with paper snowflakes on the windows and a large, rainbow-colored rug in the corner. The teacher, Mrs. Wellington, a warm-eyed woman with a soft demeanor, knelt down to Paul's eye level. She introduced herself, gently asking about his favorite animal and pointing to a wall of student drawings. Paul hesitated, glancing at the rows of small desks and the cluster of children absorbed in their morning tasks. The chatter of classmates swapping weekend stories felt like a sudden roar, and Paul's grip on Dylan's hand became vice-like. "It's okay," Dylan whispered, crouching beside him. "I'll be right here to pick you up after class." Paul gave a small nod, letting go with clear reluctance. Mrs. Wellington escorted him to an empty seat near the window where he could see the school courtyard, a welcome patch of green if he needed a focal point. All day, Dylan found himself unable to concentrate at work. He caught himself checking his phone constantly. When 3 o'clock finally arrived, Dylan nearly broke into a run heading back to the school. He spotted Paul standing timidly near the classroom door, shoulders drawn in, backpack hanging loose on his small frame. But as soon as he saw Dylan, the boy let out a breath, something halfway between relief and exhaustion. Mrs. Wellington gave Dylan a quick update. Paul had been shy and quiet, but cooperative, and he'd even drawn a picture of Levi during arts and crafts. Outside, while they walked home, Paul clutched Dylan's hand again, though this time his grip was softer, less fearful. He spoke little about his day, only offering a few nods and shrugs when Dylan asked about classmates. Yet Dylan noticed a subtle change in the boy's posture. He wasn't as hunched or guarded. Progress would be slow, Dylan knew, but the fact that Paul emerged from his first day without the haunted look in his eyes felt like a victory. And in that tiny step forward, Dylan saw the promise of brighter tomorrows for them both. Several months into their new routine, Dylan arrived home after an exhausting late shift, shoes scuffing the worn doormat, only to freeze at the sight of a white envelope perched against his front door. The streetlights overhead buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the porch. There was no return address, just his name, Officer Dylan, scrawled in agitated lettering. A chill crawled up his spine as he reached for it, every instinct telling him this wasn't just junk mail. Stepping inside, he flicked on the hallway lamp. Levi, dozing by the couch, rose to greet him with a wagging tail. Dylan, however, was too distracted to give more than a cursory pat. The dog tilted its head, sensing Dylan's tension. Without even slipping off his jacket, Dylan tore open the envelope, bracing himself for whatever news it held. The letter was written in emotional, frantic words, each sentence seeming more desperate than the last. "I made mistakes, but I want my boy back. I know he's with you. Return him, or I'll involve the authorities." A name appeared at the bottom. The woman claimed to be Paul's mother. Dylan's heart hammered. How dare she threaten to take Paul after abandoning him? Yet, beneath his initial surge of anger, anxiety simmered. Legally, if this woman was truly Paul's birth mother, she might have some rights, no matter how grievous her past actions. In the flickering light of his living room, Dylan glanced around as if the walls might offer some reassurance. 1,000 thoughts crowded his mind. What if she actually had a case? Would Paul be dragged into a bitter legal battle? Should he show Paul the letter and risk shattering the sense of security the boy had started to build? Levi let out a small whine, pressing against Dylan's leg. Dylan sighed, absently scratching the dog's ears. Placing the letter face down on the coffee table, he stared at it as though it might burst into flames. For a moment, he considered calling his lawyer friend right then and there, but the late hour and the dread of piling more worry onto an already exhausting day made him hesitate. In the end, he decided not to show Paul, at least not yet. The boy had just begun to relax into their life together, even making timid friendships at school. Another upheaval, especially one involving a woman who had once left him behind, could destroy that fragile progress. That night, after double-checking Paul's bedroom door was ajar enough to let in the hallway glow, Dylan eased himself onto the couch. He could hear the soft hum of Paul's breathing through the thin apartment walls, each exhale reassuring him the boy was safe for the moment. But Dylan's mind refused to settle. His gaze kept flicking to the envelope, guilt weighing him down. He was withholding a truth that might affect Paul's future. When fatigue finally pulled him under, Dylan's dreams were fragmented. Images of courtrooms, of Paul's fearful eyes, of Levi barking at an unseen threat. And each time he jolted awake, he'd glance toward the coffee table, half expecting the letter to have vanished. It never did. Instead, it remained a stark reminder that their tranquil life could be upended by a single piece of paper and a woman's sudden claim to motherhood. The letters did not stop. Over the next few weeks, Dylan received more notes, each increasingly insistent. The mother accused him of kidnapping her son, threatened lawsuits, and demanded that Paul be returned. In one letter she wrote, "If you ignore me, I'll drag you into court so fast you'll regret it." Every day Dylan dreaded checking his mail, worried another message would arrive. He found himself restless at night, scanning legal forms and building a folder of evidence, hospital reports, the old man's note, the living conditions in apartment 3A, anything that might prove Paul's abandonment. He also consulted with a lawyer, a friend from his academy days, who reassured him that the mother's repeated neglect and potential criminal history would work in his favor if a custody battle arose. Still, the stress took a toll. Paul, sensing Dylan's unease, became quieter. Levi clung to them both, almost as if he were a protective shield against the threats looming over their newfound peace. Determined to protect Paul, Dylan's lawyer went on a thorough investigative spree, trawling through court databases, scouring police reports, and interviewing anyone who might have information. Each new piece of evidence added another layer to a grim portrait of the woman claiming to be Paul's mother. Petty theft charges were only the tip of the iceberg. Her record includes multiple arrests for illegal possession of weapons and probation violations. At one point, the lawyer unearthed documents showing she'd jumped bail in a neighboring state, disappearing for months before resurfacing under a different last name. The most damning proof, however, was the confirmation of what Dylan already suspected. She had indeed abandoned Paul shortly after birth, leaving him in a dingy alley wrapped in nothing but a ragged blanket. A dated hospital bracelet and the old man's account backed the story. Former neighbors, contacted by Dylan's lawyer, recalled how she vanished in the dead of night, never to return. One elderly woman vividly remembered seeing the mother hurry away, an infant's cries echoing down the empty street. Despite all this, the mother's recent letters suggested she was now determined, or at least claiming, to make things right. Whether driven by guilt, desperation, or a misguided belief that she still had parental rights, she seemed bent on regaining custody of the boy she had once forsaken. The possibility of her showing up unannounced gnawed at Dylan, who couldn't shake the image of Paul's anxious expression whenever he sensed conflict. In late-night calls with his lawyer, Dylan pored over every detail. They built their case brick by brick, adding the old man's testimony in the form of a handwritten note found at the scene, corroborated by neighbors who had witnessed the mother's disappearance. Pictures of the neglected apartment where Paul had been found further illustrated the dire environment she had left him in. Step by step, Dylan's confidence in their legal standing grew. Yet, a restless worry remained. He knew all too well that courts could be unpredictable, swayed by tearful pleas or sudden turnarounds in a parent's life story. Would a judge really side with Dylan? A single man juggling a police career and a child he had no biological claim to? Each time that thought arose, he'd remind himself of the progress Paul had made, how the boy flinched less at loud noises, how he finally slept through the night without waking up screaming. Dylan wanted nothing more than to preserve the fragile sense of family they had cultivated. The stakes were high. If they lost, Paul could be torn from the only stability he'd ever known, thrust back into a world of chaos and uncertainty. And Dylan refused to let that happen. So he continued gathering evidence and doubling down on every legal requirement, prepared to face a courtroom where the difference between family and strangers could be decided by a single gavel strike. The hearing date arrived, a day Dylan had both dreaded and anticipated. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Paul clung to Dylan's side. Levi left at home with a friend for the day. Across the aisle sat the woman, her gaze darting nervously, shoulders tensed. Over the course of hours, Dylan's lawyer presented evidence of the mother's negligence, her criminal record, and the fact that she had threatened Dylan. Witnesses testified about the old man's care for Paul and the dire state in which Dylan had found him. When it was the mother's turn, she claimed she'd been through hard times and argued that she was ready to be a parent again. However, inconsistencies in her story and the documented history of abandonment weighed heavily against her. In a final statement, the judge declared that the mother's rights would be restricted until Paul turned 18. Custody remained with Dylan, who had proven a stable, supportive guardian. The ruling was a relief, but also bittersweet. Paul would never have the ordinary notion of parental love from her. Yet, seeing the boy's small smile as the gavel struck reassured Dylan that he was doing the right thing. The first real holiday they celebrated together was Thanksgiving. Dylan invited a few close friends, colleagues from the precinct, who had watched his life transform since Paul's arrival. Together, they prepared a modest feast: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables, and a pumpkin pie Dylan's friend insisted on bringing. Paul helped mash the potatoes, giggling every time Levi begged for a stray piece of butter. The apartment was warmer than it had ever been, filled with the aroma of home-cooked food and the hum of conversation. Dylan felt a swell of gratitude each time he glanced at the boy. Before they ate, Dylan suggested they each share something they were thankful for. When it was Paul's turn, he hesitated, staring at his plate. Then quietly, he said, "I'm thankful for Levi and Officer Dylan." It was the first time Paul had addressed him by name so directly, and the vulnerability in his eyes touched everyone at the table. That night, as Dylan tucked Paul into bed, the boy reached out and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." The title hung in the air, and Dylan fought back tears, knowing exactly how much it meant. A year after that fateful meeting in a dark alley, the changes were undeniable. Dylan had traded his cramped one-bedroom for a modest house with a small backyard, complete with a room full of Paul's books, crayons, and stuffed animals. Levi now enjoyed the run of the yard, chasing squirrels and napping under a tree on sunny afternoons. Paul was thriving in school, an active participant in class. He had friends, playdates, and a sense of belonging he'd never known. Dylan balanced his work schedule with fatherhood, using vacation days for school events, delegating tasks at the station when he needed to be home. Most evenings, they ate dinner together, discussing Paul's day while Levi rested at their feet, ever faithful. Dylan often thought back to that old man's final words, the heartbreak of that dilapidated apartment. He had honored the man's last wish. Paul was safe, loved, and had a future as bright as any child's. Their story stood as proof that one act of kindness, one decision to answer a call for help, could forever change the course of multiple lives. From a note in a puppy's collar to the warmth of a home, everything has transformed. And Dylan, Paul, and Levi form a family, bound not by blood, but by the purest love. How did you see their story? We would love to know how you felt, so share it in the comments and give us a like.